The Jaecoo J7 has already proved to be an incredibly popular choice within this segment. So is this plug-in hybrid merely going to make a good thing better? Now, the J7 plug-in hybrid naturally uses a very different powertrain than what we've seen from the J7 Turbo. So up front, instead of a 1.6 litre, we have a 1.5 litre petrol engine. That is then mated to an 18 kilowatt LFP blade battery, which then sends power to an electric motor mounted over the front wheels. Now, individually, both of these powertrains, the engine as well as the electric motor, produce pretty decent amounts of power and torque. However, the headline figure is that combined power output of 347 PS and 525 Newton meters of torque. 0 to 100 in this car is completed in about 8.2 or 8.6 seconds, something to that effect. And while the top speed is still pretty reasonable, the more important factor is this car can easily do 1200 kilometers on a single charge and a single full tank of fuel. Now, in terms of the overall styling, the Jaecoo J7 plug-in hybrid is broadly identical to what we saw from the Turbo. So up front, there is a split headlight design with the indicators and daytime running lights living up here with a weird checkered pattern that I still don't quite like, whereas the main beam and driving beams live down here, whereas the fog lights live towards the middle. You also have this enormous waterfall grille that is something of a signature for Jaecoo, and it's something that we look forward to seeing in further models. However, as you move further down the side, that's where you see some of the slightly more unique touches. So for example, rolling stock on this car is handled by a set of 19-inch alloy wheels with a unique aerodynamic design, and they are wrapped in Kumho Exa tires. Now, the tires themselves are decent mid-range performance, nothing to shout about there. But as for the wheels, while I understand they improve aerodynamic performance, I'm just not getting on with the way they look. I think they look a little bit funny on an SUV like this, and it doesn't help the fact that the Jaecoo J7 Turbo already had really nice looking wheels. On top of that, we also get reprofiled side mirrors that are slightly different from what we saw again from the J7 Turbo. This is again to improve aerodynamics and look very similar to the wing mirrors that we saw from the Amoda E5. Now, aside from that, you also get a little bit of that garnish down here, again with that same checkered pattern to demarcate the PHEV from the Turbo. But aside from that, everything else is the same. You get the same flush door handles, you get the same floating roof effect, and you still get the same sort of squared off arches to give this car a slightly more off-road look. Now, for those of you wondering, the LFP batteries in this car actually live underneath the floor. However, Jaecoo assures that not only has that battery been significantly protected from whatever road debris or anything that might get kicked up from the wheels, but on top of that, this battery pack is also IP68 water rated, which means that if you have to drive through a flood, there shouldn't be an issue at all. The other thing is that this car actually has dual ports for charging and refueling. So fuel goes in on the left side, whereas this side handles charging. Now, talking about charging, this actually reveals one of the J7's unique features, and that has to do with how this car is charged. So as I mentioned, there is an 18-odd kilowatt-hour LFP blade battery supplied by BYD, and that gives this car an all-electric WLTP range of 88 kilometers, although in real-world testing, it is very easy to do about 100 kilometers on a full charge. More importantly, in terms of AC charging, this car can accept up to 6.6 kilowatts, which means that you can charge the car from dead to full in about 3 hours. However, the unique part about the J7 PHEV is that it's also available with a DC fast charging CCS2 connection, making it the only plug-in hybrid in Malaysia offered with fast charging. Now, DC rated charging is up to 40 kilowatts, which means 10 to 80% takes just 20 minutes. Now, at the moment, based on current charging rates at about 1.5 or 1 ringgit 50 cent per kilowatt hour, that does mean that doing 100 kilometers on a DC FC rate like that isn't quite so attractive. However, if you were to AC charge this car at home via the highest domestic tariff at 57 cents, it works up to about 10 ringgit, which means that, again, this is about half the price of using current subsidized fuel, which means it only gets better when subsidies are repealed in the middle of this year. Now, the same goes for the rear end of the J7 PHEV, because there is nothing really to indicate that this is any different from the Turbo model. You still get the same full LED light bar that stretches from one end to the other. You still get the same checkered pattern for the brake lights and indicators, which I'm not a fan of. You still get the vertically oriented reflectors back here, and you still get the Jaecoo badge hidden within this perspex. The only thing to tell this car apart is the 7 on J7 is now done up in blue, and of course you have PHEV badging on that side. This bumper has also been ever so slightly reworked, but again, the differences are so subtle that if you aren't looking for it, you can barely tell. Now, one thing that hasn't been overly impacted is actually in terms of practicality, because behind this powered tailgate you find broadly the same amount of space that you would have found from the J7 Turbo. As a result, this space is nice and square, although it's not quite as tall as some might like. However, you can remove the parcel shelf and then enjoy even more space up here. You also get a 12-volt socket as well as some little hangers, little hooks in order for you to hang smaller items, rated for up to 3 kilograms, which means there should be more than enough for whatever it is that you bring back from a pasar, for example. You still get metal tie-down hooks, so if you want to put a net over your cargo area, you can still do that. However, underneath the boot floor, that's where you see, or you will see, a significant change in terms of overall space. Previously, you would be able to get a full-size spare tyre underneath the boot floor of a Jaecoo J7. However, in the plug-in hybrid, I have a suspicion that in order to make room for the batteries as well as some other stuff, they've had to raise the boot floor. But they have left just enough space back here for the emergency tyre repair kit as well as the charging cable that comes with the car. Now, this is important because it means that everything is hidden out of sight, so all the space that you have up here is all for you and just for cargo. And of course, if you want even more space, you can fold the rear seat 60/40 for added practicality. Now, the interior of the J7 plug-in hybrid on the surface looks similar to what we saw from the Turbo. So you have this very upright dash with a lot of soft touch materials all about the place. But when you look at the details, that's when you realize there have been some changes. For example, the material here is now no longer silver. It's done in black with a very interesting sort of pattern to it, which I actually prefer. This center console has also been redesigned, where now you get your cup holders here, as well as a bank of buttons here to control various things, such as your HVAC controls, locking and unlocking the car, as well as choosing your drive mode, as well as your powertrain mode. So you can have between Eco, Normal and Sport for your drive modes, and you can choose between EV and HEV in terms of the powertrain. Also, the door cards of this car have been significantly redesigned. The big grab handles with the exposed sort of bolts and stuff like that are all gone. Instead, a slightly more minimalist design has been employed here, although mostly the soft touch materials are still retained. However, a point of contention are actually the window controls themselves, because now these have also been minimized in order to look very similar to what we've seen before from the Proton EMA 7 as well as the Leapmotor C10. I'm not the biggest fan of this because not only are they slightly counterintuitive to use, but they've also removed the controls for the wing mirrors. Instead, those controls now live in this central screen. Talking about that, the central screen employed in the plug-in hybrid is the larger unit that we saw from the J7 all-wheel drive. As a result, this fills up the space quite nicely, but of course it does jut down into this little tray here, which means that if you're taking phones out of the wireless charger, you tend to smack them on the bottom of the screen, as I have with my phone. Now, beyond that, this screen is relatively good. In terms of the response times, the graphics is all pretty decent. And because the HVAC controls live in here, there's always this ribbon at the bottom of the screen in order to control your temperatures, and of course, just tapping that allows you to adjust things like your seat ventilation, etc. It is worth pointing out that if you use the wireless Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, it takes up the entirety of the screen. And in order to access the HVAC controls, you always just swipe from the bottom in order to reveal them. This has been surprisingly more reliable than what we've seen from a lot of other cars, and so I appreciate the fact that it is as responsive as it is. Now, moving beyond that, we also get a digital instrument cluster on this screen that's sort of just planted on top of the dash, and it is very clear and very legible. I also appreciate the fact that the design of this screen, or the design of the interface at least, is a lot easier to read than what we saw from the J7 Turbo, and so you get all the information that you want at a glance, as well as a display for your ADAS functionality. If that's not enough, you also get a full color heads-up display, again with the same functionality to show you your ADAS system, etc., which means that, again, all of this works really well together. Now, in terms of the practical aspects, again, you get a couple of cup holders here, and because the gear selector has now been moved up here, you get even more space underneath the center console. You also still get the cooled center console bin here with a little aircon vent opening at the rear in order to keep items in here nice and cool. You get a decently sized glove box here, although it's not lined in any sort of soft touch material, so anything you put in here might rattle. You get decently sized door bins, big enough for a liter sized bottle, and you also get little pockets up here to hold smaller items like my access cards. So all of this so far looks pretty good. The J7 plug-in hybrid also benefits from using the same 8-speaker Sony audio system that we saw from the J7 Turbo. You also get the full panoramic glass roof, again, like what we saw from the J7 Turbo. So all in all, everything in here is specified pretty well. The only things about this interior that I don't like are the steering wheel, which is the same issue that I have with the standard non-plug-in hybrid J7, where the directional pads on either side control a multitude of different things and it's not immediately obvious in terms of what it does. But the stalks are also a problem for me because having the gear selector on the right side is not so much of an issue. It's the fact that this left stalk now does multiple things. So in addition to it being the indicator controls, you also have the controls for the front and rear wiper. The only problem is, while this car does come with an automatic wiper system for the front, or rather for the windscreen, I can't seem to find any sort of control for the frequency of it. It's not in the screen and it's certainly not here, so I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with that. This was especially annoying yesterday when there was a very sudden rainstorm, because suddenly in automatic mode it wasn't wiping fast enough. In the back of the J7 plug-in hybrid, life back here is pretty good. With the front seat set in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, you can see I have a good amount of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom despite that standard fit panoramic sunroof with its electric sunblind. However, sitting back here does reveal a couple of things about this car that are worth pointing out, some minor and some major. The minor point is the fact that once again we have a single rear air conditioning vent. Although it's wide enough to accommodate two separate vents, for Jaecoo they've decided that one vent is enough, which means that if you have two passengers back here, you are going to be fighting for use of that rear aircon vent. The second issue is a little bit more major. Now, because the J7 plug-in hybrid utilizes those blade batteries that I've mentioned multiple times now, which live underneath the floor, as you can see, the floor in this car has moved up a little bit, which means that if sat like this, I don't have that much in terms of under-thigh support. However, because the front seats are mounted quite high, there is plenty of space for me to tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me, which means that I can get comfortable back here if I want to, provided that the driver at least is not too tall. That said, however, anyone sat in the center seat will not enjoy any sort of relief at all, because while the floor is nice and flat, because the floor is still high and there's not that much space for them to stretch out, it does mean that they will suffer from this under-thigh support issue. Now, beyond that, life back here is pretty positive because all the materials that you feel and touch are all nice and soft touch, which again lends to the fact that this feels like a much more upmarket car than its price point might suggest. Other amenities include 3 pockets behind the rear seats, which is certainly nice, a USB-A and USB-C port mounted in the middle. You get Boss switches to adjust the front seats, which means that you can make more room for the second row should you want to. And you also get a deployable center armrest here with a couple of cup holders, and because it floats like this, it does feel nice and sturdy and it's at a very nice angle for you to use. Now, these rear seats do actually have a adjustable recline function, which means that you can get it to lean back in one of 2 stages for you to get nice and comfy. So overall, life is pretty good. I certainly wouldn't complain as a rear seat passenger. Now, if you have children, there are ISOFIX mounts on these 2 outer seats, which is certainly nice to see, and the doors do open wide enough, which means that even a bulky rear-facing child seat should not be a problem at all. Now, of course, the thing about the J7 plug-in hybrid is that it is a plug-in hybrid, which means that this car theoretically should also be a lot more efficient in addition to being a lot more powerful, although that is obviously better experienced in the front seat. Now, before we get into the actual driving experience of the Jaecoo J7 PHEV, I first need to geek out a little bit about this powertrain. So the way it works is it's very similar to the Haval H6 HEV, whereby the internal combustion engine in the front works primarily as a generator in order to generate power for the lithium-ion battery, or the LFP battery rather, that powers this car. Which means that 90% of the time when you drive this car around, you're driving it basically as an electric vehicle where motivation is provided via the traction motor. However, it's only at higher speeds where there is a DHT or dedicated hybrid transmission rather, that allows the engine to power the front wheels directly, and it only does so when it feels that it is the most efficient way to move the car forwards. So because of that, because you drive this car primarily as an EV, primarily being driven by the electric motor, the experience driving this is also very similar to that of an EV. So for example, when you're just potting about in town doing urban speeds like I am now, the way this car responds to throttle input is very similar to an electric vehicle. On top of that, the electric motor in this car is quite sizable. It's got, I think, 300-ish Newton meters of torque, which means that when you do put your foot down, it does pick up and go quite convincingly like an electric car. I'm not sure if you can tell, but my head was actually moving about there as a result of that torque. And so that means that progress driving at slower speeds is very, very smooth. Because there's no gearbox, there's no turbo lag, there's not 1,000 different components working together in order to get the car off the line. Instead, it's just the electric motor doing its thing, being fed by power from the lithium ion battery, LFP. Now, it's only at higher speeds, again, that the internal combustion motor kicks in to drive the wheels. However, if you are driving like I am now, I've got, I think, about 15%, 20% battery left remaining. This is when you'll hear the internal combustion engine kick on and off as it sees fit in order to provide power to that battery. So where this car differentiates itself from vehicles like the H6 HEV as well as Honda's eHEV system is that you have the option to charge the battery. So if you talk about the GWM Haval H6, that car runs a very small battery. I think it's about 1.8 kilowatts or something like that, so 1.8 kilowatt hours. Whereas this car runs an 18 kilowatt hour battery, which means that you have more significant electric range to drive about in. And so because you have that bigger battery, that's why it also comes with the ability to charge it separately as its own thing. Now, there are some benefits and there are some drawbacks to this. The benefit, obviously, is the fact that you have a much more significant and much more impactful all-electric range, which means that, for example, the average Malaysian commute, which is about 30 to 40 kilometers a day, can be done very easily with a full charge in this car. In fact, you could probably commute for 2 days on a single charge, which means that, again, it means that when you're stuck in traffic, when you're just doing the daily grind, you can rely on electric motivation to move you along. And that is significant because it means that, again, the petrol engine never kicks in. As a result, progress is smooth, it's very quiet, and more importantly, it is a lot more efficient, particularly when you're caught in traffic. However, the downside of this is this car is quite heavy, at least compared to the GWM Haval H6 as well as, to some extent, the Kicks e-Power. If we were to look specifically at the weight of the battery itself, the weight of the battery in the Jaecoo J7 is significantly heavier because it's a bigger battery. However, there are some benefits to that battery being heavy, which I will touch on a little bit later. But overall, when you're sat here, for the most part, you don't really know what the powertrain is doing because the petrol engine sort of kicks on and off very smoothly and very discreetly, which means you can barely tell. Sometimes when you're stationary like this, if the petrol engine kicks in, you can feel a little bit of judder in the cabin, but it's very, very minor and it's only when the engine starts. Once it reaches idle, it's very, very quiet, and so you don't really notice. More so if you have the music going or, again, if you're moving along, because then you have road noise to contend with that as well. And when you're out on the motorway, because I've covered about 700 kilometers in this car already, some of which included motorway cruises at high speed up to Ipoh and back, and that also revealed the fact that, again, when the engine kicks on and off when you're driving along, you can't really tell. Because this engine is quite small and it's also set very far away from the bulkhead with a lot of sound deadening in between, it means that you just don't notice that engine chiming on and off. So, for the most part, being sat here, you don't really know what the car's doing and you don't really pay attention because it's not really important. However, the benefit of this car being slightly heavier means that the Jaecoo J7 actually has a slightly different suspension tune compared to the turbo model. This is to do with things like weight management and weight distribution, as well as obviously the total weight of the car itself. So because the weight of the Jaecoo J7 PHEV is more towards the floor and more low down, and also significantly heavier than the J7 Turbo, it means that the suspension has been revised in order to better manage that weight. If this car ran the same suspension setup as we saw from the J7 Turbo, it is very possible, in fact, that this car would have ended up being really wallowy to drive. And that is because, again, when you have a soft suspension setup with all that weight low down, the car will end up being a little bit floaty, a little bit bouncy. And so that wouldn't be something that Malaysian customers would have liked very much. Instead, the suspension in this car has been beefed up to manage that weight. And as a result, it means that while the primary ride in this car remains relatively pliant and soft, the way we've come to expect from Jaecoo, the secondary ride, however, is a lot better. And as a result, it means that when you do hit bigger undulations, the car settles down much much faster and actually creates a far more confident driving experience behind the wheel. In fact, when I took this car to Ipoh, driving at about 110, 120 kilometers an hour, just on cruise control, just driving along, the car felt so much more planted compared to the turbocharged model. This to me is or rather a surprise side effect of this extra weight and of this revised suspension, and it results in this car feeling a lot more composed compared to the turbocharged model that preceded it. However, you can't really beat physics, and so if you were to drive this car more intently off of a motorway, say on back roads and so on, and if you're driving this car enthusiastically, it's very easy for you to find the limits of grip in this car because there is a lot more weight to it. These Kumho XR tires do the best they can to manage the weight and manage your expectations, but in reality, again, you can't really run from physics. This is not a car that you want to chuck about because that battery is so heavy, because the car as a whole is significantly heavier than the turbocharged model. But that said, the turbo model wasn't all that fun to drive anyway, so I suppose having those expectations coming into this PHEV might be a little bit sort of unrequired or uncalled for. Now, beyond the driving experience from behind the wheel, there is also the experience of simply being in this cabin. Now, when you drive about in town, as I am now, because the majority of your force is provided by the electric motor, you don't really hear the engine. And of course, if you're being driven along on electricity, there is no engine noise, so to speak, which means that progress is very smooth and very, very quiet. But when you're on the motorway, I have discovered that this car is not quite as quiet as I would have liked. A lot of these Chinese cars have gotten very, very good at insulating the cabin, especially when you're driving at motorway speeds. Although unfortunately, the Jaecoo J7 PHEV is the same as the J7 Turbo in that motorway refinement is a little bit of a weak point for this car. When you cruise at around 110, 120 kilometers an hour, you will realize there is quite a lot of road noise from these Kumho tires. And wind noise is not that very well suppressed either, because despite these more aerodynamic wing mirrors, there is a little bit of wind noise that comes from about the A pillar, so it's a little bit more from the B pillar, and this is despite the fact that the glass in the front half of the car is acoustic glass or dual laminate glass in order to minimize the amount of noise intrusion into the cabin. However, if you keep your expectations reasonable, which I think you should given the price point that this car is targeting, then at that point there isn't really all that much to complain about. This car is excellent at what it is. And then, of course, there is the fact that this car's real-world economy is absolutely fantastic. So, talking about that specifically, this car touts a range of well over 1,000 kilometers on a single tank of fuel. And that's before we take into account the electric battery, which can provide up to 100 kilometers of range. Now, the official quoted WLTP range on the battery is again 88 kilometers. But in my testing, this car will comfortably do 100 kilometers on a single charge without too much issue whatsoever. Which means that, again, realistically, you can drive this car around as an EV most of the time. But having driven this car all the way to Ipoh and back, doing motorway speeds in order to try and exhaust the battery and also to figure out what this car's real-world economy is like, I've also discovered that, again, if just running the internal combustion engine, you will find that this car is incredibly efficient. Now, based on my current trip reading, if I were to just check that very quickly, now, I've already covered 733 kilometers in this car since I have collected it. And based on the meter cluster at the moment, it says I still have 484 kilometers left running on petrol alone. Bear in mind that, once again, my electric battery at the moment is claiming a range of about 16 kilometers, and I am hearing the engine sort of chime in and out as it goes along. It tries to maintain the charge status at about 20% thereabouts for better battery health. And so it's charging and discharging as I'm going along. So the fact that I'm not driving particularly efficiently, I'm driving about in town, you can see the speeds I'm doing now, and even then the car is consuming very, very little fuel. And given the fact that this car runs a 60-litre fuel tank, which means that a full tank will cost you about 120, 130 ringgit, and a full charge on this via a domestic socket will cost you about another 10 ringgit. That means for a total of 140 ringgit, it is very reasonable to expect this car to be able to do 1,300 kilometers on one tank and one full charge. This is in line with the expectations set by a bunch of motoring journalists who were invited by Jaecoo to drive these cars from Singapore through Malaysia and all the way up into Thailand, although that didn't include us for some reason. So this is very positive. It means that this is a car that you can really utilize and exploit the best of this powertrain even if you can't plug it in. This is very different from the PHEV experiences that we've had before from luxury car makers, because I have found that with Mercedes-Benzes and BMWs and Volvos, etc., if you don't charge the plug-in hybrid battery, you will find that performance is hampered, the fuel economy tends to spike unreasonably, and so it becomes a bit of a burden. It means that you end up having to look for chargers wherever you go, whereas in this car, even if you can't charge it, like I can't because I live in a condo, the fuel economy is still really good. Over the last 50 kilometers, I've been driving this car around, again primarily on the petrol motor, it's still returning 5.8 liters to the 100. Now, I will point out the fact that 5.8 liters to the 100 is actually a little bit lower than what we saw from the Haval H6 HEV. Now, that car, because it has a smaller battery and so you're always reliant on the internal combustion engine to provide electricity, that car was returning about 6 liters to the 100 on average, and that was also including a drive that I took to Penang and back and being caught in traffic and stuff like that. Whereas this car has taken me on an Ipoh trip, and again, I've been caught in traffic and so on and so forth. I have driven 2 full batteries on this car, having been able to charge it up. And so with that in mind, I think that using this and living with this is a very, very reasonable affair. And then we get onto this car's ADAS functionality. Now, if you've watched my review of the J7 Turbo, I did mention that the ADAS functionalities in this car, particularly the adaptive cruise control with traffic jam assist, is not quite as polished an experience as I would like from a car pushing this sort of pricing. However, having driven the plug-in hybrid, I have come to discover that either A, they've updated the software for it, or B, which is the most likely scenario, because this car is not fighting the ridiculously inept dual-clutch automatic gearbox that the J7 comes with, it's just ended up a lot smoother. Progress is a lot smoother, deceleration is a lot smoother, and I'm happy to report that even when you use the adaptive cruise control, when the car slows down, it still uses regen. Now, because the ACC and TJA in this car is so much smoother, it means that I can actually rely on this car to drive me through traffic, which is a much, much more positive experience compared to, again, the J7 that I've driven before. And in terms of its overall context, I think that this car is about as good as the GWM Haval H6 in that regard, and slightly better than the Proton X70, although obviously that car is not a hybrid and should be significantly cheaper than this J7 PHEV. So overall, I do think that this is a very solid and certainly a very attractive package, particularly for urbanites looking for an electrified family SUV that will be able to drive them more efficiently moving forwards, especially again as we consider fuel subsidy repeals in the middle of 2025. It is possible that some middle-class customers may be negatively impacted as a result. And so if you're in the market for a electrified or hybrid family SUV, something that will drive you and your family very efficiently and very comfortably, the Jaecoo J7 PHEV is certainly worth considering. However, there is a caveat to this. If you live in a landed property or if you have access to charging at home, then this J7 PHEV is certainly the car that I would recommend, simply because being able to do a more significant amount of driving on electric power alone means that you can be truly very, very efficient in the sort of scenarios where an internal combustion car is traditionally very inefficient. However, if your lifestyle and if your living situation is like mine, where you live in a condo without access to even a 3-pin plug, then I would recommend the Haval H6 HEV. In fact, one of my neighbors has one, no doubt as a result of this consideration, because that car provides the same amount of performance, the same amount of torque, and the same broad experience in terms of driving and in terms of dynamics, while not having the added complication of having to plug in the car. And because that battery is also significantly smaller, that car also feels a lot lighter on its feet, and even when you use the petrol engine to drive it along, it should be more efficient as a result. And of course, if you're looking at both of these cars and thinking, I like the powertrain, but I don't need a car this big, then of course there is the Nissan Kicks e-Power, a car that we rate very highly on account of that powertrain being so incredibly polished, despite that car being so incredibly small. So if you want a city car, you've got the Nissan Kicks. If you want a family car, you've got the GWM Haval H6 or this Jaecoo J7. But the bottom line is, consider very carefully how you use your car, because one of these three should be the ideal vehicle for you, based specifically on those conditions. The Jaecoo J7 plug-in hybrid is now available for 158,800 ringgit, comprising of a 7-year 150,000 kilometer warranty as well as a separate 8-year 160,000 kilometer warranty for the high voltage battery. In addition to this, Jaecoo Malaysia is offering a 1-to-1 replacement of the battery should the state of health drop to below 70% within those 8 years. In addition to this, the Jaecoo J7 plug-in hybrid is currently available with an early bird package comprising of a V2L system as well as a 10-year, 1 million kilometer engine and battery warranty. But in any case, that concludes our review of the Jaecoo J7 PHEV. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe and jangan bodoh.